So in this section, we're talking about how all species are interrelated to one another. Now, certainly when I say that, that doesn't mean that all species are equally related to one another. You are more distantly related to a ladybug than you are to a cat or a dog, or you're more closely related to a chimpanzee than you are to, a gibbon. And so the way that we represent those relationships is with phylogenetic trees. And these trees can be a little bit weird, a little bit difficult to understand if you don't quite know what's going on. So I wanted to spend some time explaining what was happening with these in detail. So here we have species 1, species 2, and species 3 represented. These trees, one axis is going to represent time. It can go in any direction. So this could be pointing up, this could be pointing right, this could be pointing down, which would be weird. People usually don't do that. But one direction represents time. And so if one represents time, then certainly the other one must represent something interesting, right? Wrong. The other direction is arbitrary. So unless something is very odd on a phylogenetic tree and it's specifying something else, this direction is meaningless. And so what that means is that these two are actually the same exact phylogenetic tree. Even though here species 1 and 2 look like they're closer together, they aren't. Because remember, the only direction that matters is this X direction. This other one is completely arbitrary. So that's something to keep in the back of your head. Trees can be constructed in different ways to emphasize certain things, and that's why you might see this direction expanding or contracting, but only one of these directions actually matters. The next thing to think about is these branch points, or where these things are splitting from one another. And what do those actually represent? Well, what those represent is a common ancestor. Oops. These represent a common ancestor, okay? So there was some organism here, some population that is the common ancestor of species 1 and 2. Okay, this is their common ancestor. So then you could ask, well, what's the common ancestor between species 1 and species 3? Well, that's all the way back down here. And in this particular tree, this is what is called a root. It is the common ancestor of everything on this tree, and that is called a root. Okay, so one direction is time, the other direction doesn't matter. It's just used to help spread things out so that you can read the tree more easily or to emphasize certain things. Wherever you see a branch point, that is a common ancestor, and sort of the deepest common ancestor on a particular tree is the root. And so the other thing I want to talk about is that species 1 and 2 are referred to as sister taxa. They're very close to one another. They are sisters. This is at least the second time we've seen the term sister used in biology. I'm not sure why they're sisters and not brothers or neighbors or whatever, but species 1 and 2 are sister taxa because they're super closely related to one another. So with that information, let's look at another phylogenetic tree. This is a phylogenetic tree of primates. And so you see here's us up here. We have humans, we have bonobos, we have chimpanzees. Notice that humans aren't like the furthest right on here. And again, that's just because of the way this tree was constructed. You could have easily flipped them around and put humans over there. It would still showcase the exact same relationship. And so I asked a question on here, but before we get to that, let's identify some important points. Humans, bonobos, and chimps are, you would call these sister taxa. And actually bonobos and chimps themselves are sister taxa as well. They're just very closely related to one another. In the same sense that eastern lowland gorillas and western gorillas are sister taxa. Okay? Closely related. We also have something here that I didn't mention. This is gibbons. Gibbons appear to be an outgroup for this particular phylogeny, and an outgroup is just used to make comparisons. So you can say, well, yeah, clearly these things are very closely related to one another, we have this distantly related group that we can use as sort of a comparison. So anyway, back to the question at hand. Where is the common ancestor of humans and orangutans? Is it A, B, C, or D? I don't know why I put them out of order like this, but we should be able to identify. I'm just giving you an example of how I'm going to ask you this question on a test or a quiz. The common ancestor of humans and orangutans is D. Okay, so if you go and let's find humans, and let's go back to the common branch point of orangutans. Okay, and so D, you can see here, branches. One of those goes and eventually becomes humans. One of those goes and becomes orangutans. Okay, so D is the common ancestor of humans and orangutans. I pointed it out. It's right there. There it is. The common ancestor. Let me ask. Let's do one more. We're going to get to what is a clade, but let's talk about another common ancestor. So let's say, the common ancestor of bonobos and chimps. That's probably the easiest one to find, right? So go ahead and find it, or skip ahead if you got this already. But chimps and bonobos, common ancestor right there. Humans and chimps, our most recent common ancestor is right there. Gorillas and this human-chimp group, well, the common ancestor is right here. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. What is a clade? And this is where a lot of people can get easily tripped up. So make sure you're paying attention. Make sure you're contacting me if you're not quite understanding what's going on here. Basically, a clade is something where you can circle that organism, its most recent common ancestor, and the other organism without cutting something off, which kind of sounds super random, but let's talk about what we're actually doing here. So, can you circle all the ancestors and the species involved without cutting anything else out? So if I were to ask you something like, are humans, chimps, and bonobos, are those three species together a clade? The first thing that you need to do is identify their common ancestor, which is right here. Now, can we put a big circle around these three without cutting anything off? And pretty clearly, yeah, you can. My circle kind of got cut off, but we didn't cut off any of the species, right? All of our species are in here. We could draw a circle without picking up our pen. Now let's ask a slightly different question. Are humans and chimps a clade? This is also called monophyletic. By the way, you would ask, are they monophyletic? It means the same thing, for our purposes anyway. So are humans and chimps a clade? Well, let's find their most recent common ancestor down here. Now can we put a circle around humans and chimps without cutting anything off? And you can't, because you have to cut out our friend the bonobo. So on this particular tree, humans and chimps do not represent a clade. They are non-monophyletic. All right, so our humans, chimps, bonobos is this whole group here, and western gorillas, just this one here. Do those represent a clade? Well, let's find the common ancestor of western gorillas in these three, and that's down here. It's at this point. Here is the common ancestor of those. Now, can we put a big circle around those without cutting anything off? And no, we cannot. You have to cut off the other gorillas in order to make this into a clade. And so this is actually what is referred to as a paraphyletic group. I'm probably not going to ask you about anything that serious. We may not even talk about paraphyletic or polyphyletic, but you should know how to figure out what a clade is. And again, a clade is the same thing as a monophyletic group. You find the common ancestor, you try to draw a circle about everything in question. If you can do it without cutting anything off, you have a clade. If you can't do it without cutting anything off, you do not. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about how phylogenetic trees are actually constructed. And so there's a way of doing it like this using literal characteristics, and there's a way of doing it using genetics, but that's for next time.